In her essay Musique et Roman de Formation, Aude Locatelli argues that Thomas Bernhard's novel The Loser, in which the protagonist's competition with Glenn Gould leads to his eventual suicide, subjects the musical Bildungsroman to an ironic rewriting, what she calls an act of, and I'm quoting, revenge against the utopian representation of the education of the artist that exalts one in which the figure of the genius is exalted. The other act of revenge in the form of a musical Bildungsroman that Locatelli mentions is Elfriede Jelinek, The Piano Teacher, novel that you may be perhaps even more familiar with than Bernhard's novel, which is both very great works indeed. Throughout her essay, Locatelli contrasts both of these modernist, Austrian, in both cases, Austrian examples with two classic French Bildungsroman, Georges Sand's Consuelo and Romain Rolland's Jean-Christophe. Locatelli's analysis of these two pairings leads her to conclude that the passage from the classic to her modernist examples illustrates the shift from the artist with a mission to the artist without one. Locatelli's formula in French is even more lapidary in French, where she speaks of le passage de l'artiste missionnaire à celui de l'artiste démissionnaire. So missionnaire with a mission, démissionnaire, having resigned, having given up. This reading of The Loser, while offering an accurate account of the actual events of the novel, ignores Bernhard's strategy, already used by such writers as James Joyce and Samuel Beckett, of quote-unquote redeeming the explicit failure of the artist protagonist by means of the implicit success of the writer himself, whose own artistic development parallels that of the protagonist, but also departs from it in a significant way. We just take the example of Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, where Stephen Dedalus, the artist as a young man, and Joyce pointed out it's the artist as a young man, not necessarily as a fully developed, fully achieved artist. What is Stephen Dedalus, who wants to be an artist? He eventually writes a poem in the form of a villanelle. What is the French expression, ça vaut ce que ça vaut, it's worth what it's worth. It's okay. It's not a work of great genius. It's not one of the most memorable, most immortal villanelles. On the other hand, Joyce himself writes the novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, in which this villanelle is contained as a minor feature, and the novel itself, to be sure, is a classic work of modernist writing, of modernist fiction, and which interestingly concludes in chapter 5 with Daedalus's notebook, his diary, all these little fragmentary lines that prefigure the massive experimental achievement of Joyce's novel Ulysses. The protagonist of The Loser, to get back to Bernhard now, the protagonist of The Loser, an aspirant to pianistic distinction named Wertheimer, is capable of wanting only to become Glenn Gould. So that's referring back to the title of my talk, Becoming Bach, Bernhard becoming Bach, and Wertheimer within the novel attempting, with rather catastrophic consequences to be sure, wanting only to become Glenn Gould. For this reason, he is doomed to act out a struggle with a superior rival, Gould himself, in the form of a person who already is Glenn Gould. Throughout the novel, the narrator takes unseemly pleasure in reminding us of Wertheimer's fondness for emulation. And here's a quotation. Wertheimer wasn't capable of seeing himself as a unique and autonomous being, as people can and must if they don't want to despair. Wertheimer didn't have that possibility, and so he always only wanted to be Glenn Gould, or yes, Gustav Mahler, or Mozart and comrades. He emulated anybody he thought was better off than he was. He'd absolutely wanted to be an artist and thus walked into the mouth of disaster. Like the narrator, Wertheimer had gone to Salzburg to study with Horowitz in the hope of gaining eventual fame as the greatest pianistic virtuoso of his time. His suicide 28 years later was fated from the moment that this distinction was irrevocably snatched from him by Glenn Gould. As the narrator explains, again a quotation, if Wertheimer hadn't walked past room 33 in the Mozarteum 28 years ago, precisely at 4 p.m, he wouldn't have hanged himself. He wouldn't have hanged himself 28 years later in Zizzes by Kerr, I thought. Wertheimer's fate was to have walked past room 33. There is no room 33, by the way, in the Mozarteum. My wife and I were there in Salzburg several years ago. But anyway, putting that aside, walked past room 33 in the Mozarteum at the precise moment when Glenn Gould was playing the so-called aria in that room. Regarding this event, Wertheimer reported to me that he stopped at the door of room 33, listening to Glenn play until the end of the aria. Then I understood what shock is, I thought now. Having failed as a musician, Wertheimer turned his emulating proclivities to the writing of aphorisms, a pursuit in which he merely made his mark, in the narrator's judgment, quote, as Schopenhauer II, so to speak, or Kant II, Novalis II, filling in this embarrassing pseudo-philosophy with Brahms and Handel and Chopin and Rachmaninoff. As the title of my talk is intended to imply, Bernhard himself becomes Bach and thus succeeds where Wertheimer fails Wertheimer, of course, fails at becoming Glenn Gould. And Bernhard does this by creating a prose style that emulates, but in a highly original way, both Johann Sebastian Bach's fugal compositions. The original way. That's a mistake. Both should not be there. That he emulates in a highly original way Bach's fugal compositions. I would further argue that he also becomes Glenn Gould by emulating, in the literary rather than the musical realm, certain aspects of Glenn Gould's style of performance. A less obvious but no less formative element in Bernhard's emulative originality lies in his creating a hallmark style of hyperbolic vituperation whose roots lie not in Gould's performance of the Goldberg variations, but, more tellingly, in Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. Far from leading him into the trap of sterile emulation, Bach and Gould, each in his own distinctive way, provide Bernhard with models whose influence is everywhere discernible in his own work. As Michael Olson has said, instead of analyzing Bach in song and music sheets, as he did in his youth, Bernhard switched to writing types of fugues in his adult years. His typewriter, rather than his vocal cords, became the medium with which Bernhard controlled his physical surroundings and modulated his artistic sensibility. Olson even contends that Bernhard outdid Bach by introducing 3 primary lines as the foundations for his subsequent variations. René Botlang describes the importance of Bernhard's encounter with Glenn Gould in a way that reads like a creative rewriting of Wertheimer's crippling experience. According to Botlang, Bernhard found a brother in Glenn Gould, as did Samuel Beckett in the Dutch painter Bram van Velde. In Gould, the greatest of the great pianists, he found a model of purity. Bernhard then found a model of purity that the author was to emulate in his writing, Bernhard was to emulate in his writing. In a remark that parallels Mark Olson's claim about Bernhard's superiority over Bach, Botlang further contends that Bernhard may even have enjoyed a certain advantage over Glenn Gould, since unlike Bernhard, who was a creator, Gould was a performer, perhaps only, as it were, a performer. Edward Said, in an essay on Gould that mentions the loser only in passing, makes a number of observations that help us to appreciate further the highly original ways in which Bernhard incorporated the figure of Gould into his novel. Of particular interest is Said's discussion of the various forms of audience provocation that Gould brought to the concert hall. According to Said, Gould, quote, belonged to no dynasty of teachers or national schools and played repertory, for example, William Byrd, Svilank, and Gibbons, Orlando Gibbons then, that had never been thought before as furnishing staples for a piano recital program. He argues further that we find in Gould, and here we may think as well of Thomas Bernhard, a totally unanticipated talent, aggressively challenging the placid and passive audience that has learned to sit back and wait to be served a short evening's fare, like diners in a good restaurant. Said also calls attention to Gould's place in an historical process that, beginning with classical composers who were also performers, later witnessed the emergence of the virtuoso performer, who is not himself a musician. Glenn's originality lay not in the creating musical compositions that rivaled Bach's, but in his own idiosyncratic recreations of them, and that idea that of Bernhard as a virtuoso performer, but in the literary rather than the musical, or in a literary realm, which is a kind of a transition from the musical, an adaptation, a recreation of the musical. The point that I would like to make about Bernhard's creative emulation of Nazi propaganda was suggested to me by a remark that George Steiner once made about the anti-Semitic writings of Louis Ferdinand Céline. It was a review article in the New Yorker. Steiner maintained that if we were to recreate or to rewrite Céline's anti-Semitic tracts, which Bagatelle Point Massacre is the most famous of them, I suppose, and we replace the word Jew every time that the word Jew occurred with human beings, that Céline himself would end up sounding remarkably like Jonathan Swift. Remember Jonathan Swift's Modest Proposal? It's all about the Irish. Replacing Céline's writing with Hitler's Mein Kampf prepares us to recognize the astuteness of Suzanne Hummel's comment that Bernhard heard the shouting of the Nazis during his youth and spent his whole life counter-shouting. It's a very useful, very, very helpful term, the counter-shouting of Bernhard's prose counter-shouting against the Nazis in his writing. Examples of this kind of shouting that Bernhard would have heard during his childhood and adolescence include, and this is from chapter 10 of Hitler's Mein Kampf, entitled Causes of the Collapse, in which Hitler attributes the defeat of the Reich in World War I not to the German people themselves, but to a parasitic community living amongst them, the Jews, of course, a group of people for whom Germany was a mere stopover for making and spending money. So a traditional anti-Semitic stereotype. In a similar vein, Hitler, attributes the big lie according to which Ludendorff is to blame to a people whom he designates as, in quotes, lie virtuosos who have attempted to foist this falsehood about Ludendorff then, to foist this falsehood on the essentially simple and credulous German people. And then in terms that uncannily echo the disease that brought an untimely end to Bernhard's life, tuberculosis, then from which he suffered. He was, 59 when he died. And in the final several months, perhaps a year, I'm not quite sure, of his life, he couldn't sleep lying down. He had to sit up because of the way his lungs would otherwise fill up. So in a uncanny echo of the disease that brought an untimely end at age 59 to Bernhard's life, Hitler then explains that the reason that the German people allowed the Jews to fester in their midst for so long is that, like tuberculosis, the threat to the good health of the people that they represented, that they, the Jews, then represented, was slow in being recognized. Hitler's remedy is, in effect, to think of the Jews as a form of plague, which, as he points out, was eradicated long before tuberculosis, what was in the case of tuberculosis eradicated long ago, because its pernicious effects of tuberculosis then were recognized much sooner. Bernhard's counter-shouting, whereby parasitic community is replaced by a parasitic minority then, is replaced by the non-Jewish Austrian majority, may be noticed in the author's description of Salzburg as a city which at bottom is the sworn enemy of all art and culture, a cretinous provincial dump with stupid people and cold walls where everything without exception is eventually made cretinous. And of the Lower Alps, in Austria then, the Lower Alps as a place that makes for, quote, emotionally disturbed people who fall victim to cretinism at a very early age and who in time become malevolent. So again, not the Jews, turning the tables upside down as a returning of the tables, in which it's not the tuberculosis that the Jews bring, but the cretinism to which the Austrians themselves, the Austrian, non-Jewish Austrians, are prone. Bernhard's critique extends to the poor quality of Austrian inns, which, according to the narrator, are all filthy and unappetizing. I thought one can barely get a clean tablecloth in one of these inns, never mind cloth napkins, which in Switzerland, for example, are quite standard. Even the tiniest inn in Switzerland is clean and appetizing. Even our finest Austrian hotels are filthy and unappetizing. And talk about the rooms, I thought. Often, they just iron over sheets that have already been slept in. And it's not uncommon to find clumps of hair in the sink from the previous guest. Austrian inns have always turned my stomach, I thought. The plates aren't clean, and upon closer inspection, the silverware is almost always dirty. In typically Bernhardian fashion, this diagnosis is then taken to an even more hyperbolic extreme. I took a few steps toward the kitchen window, although I'd already realized I couldn't look through the kitchen window because, as already mentioned, it's covered with filth from top to bottom. Austrian kitchen windows are all totally filthy, and we can't look through them, and naturally, it is our greatest advantage, I thought, not to be able to look through them, because then we find ourselves staring into the mouth of catastrophe, into the chaos of Austrian kitchen filth. In Extinction, the last of his novels in order of publication, Bernhard launched a Parthian shot at the very language in which Mein Kampf was written. This is a quotation. German is essentially an ugly language, which not only grinds all thought into the ground. He may be thinking of Martin Heidegger. Didn't Heidegger say something along, you can only write philosophy in German? Something along those lines in any event. So this is a kind of counter shouting or response, a riposte to Heidegger, perhaps, about which he has very funny things to say in other of his works. German is essentially an ugly language, which not only grinds all thought into the ground, but actually falsifies everything with its ponderousness. It's quite incapable of expressing a simple truth as such. By its very nature, it falsifies everything. It's a crude language, devoid of musicality. And if it weren't my mother tongue, I wouldn't speak it. The German language is completely anti-musical, thoroughly common and vulgar. And that's why our literature seems common and vulgar. German writers have always had only the most primitive instrument to play on. One wonderful musical metaphor, to be sure. With such examples of these doubtlessly in mind, W.G. Sebald has rightly observed that it is impossible to deduce a serious political program from Bernhard's writings. As I've already suggested, the real significance of these diatribes lies in Bernhard's comic literary rewriting, his literary inversion, then, of a political discourse that in real life had horrific consequences, and again, with which he was so familiar in his childhood. The contrast between the bleakness of the world that Bernhard depicts and the elation that we experience in reading his novels, which is quite extraordinary pleasure. They're very, very funny and very lyrical, very musical, very rhythmical, for sure. In reading his novels has been well expressed by the novelist Tim Parks in an issue of the New York Review of Books. This was back in 2007. Parks says, the world described by Bernhard then, the world described as ugly, the reflections leave no space for optimism, so Bernhard's own reflections leave no reason for optimism, but the mechanism invented for delivering the bad news is nevertheless exhilarating. Parks then adds, the antithetical energies, it's a good phrase, the antithetical energies unleashed in these books lay down a pulse in the reader's mind, and their prose is as near to unforgettable as any prose I know. And certainly any prose I know as well. Bernhard's Bach-like prose does indeed leave an indelible mark in the memories of his readers. As importantly, it allowed Bernhard himself to affirm his own utter originality, while at the same time clearly borrowing from the work of his predecessors, these being, in the case of The Loser, the incongruous threesome of Johann Sebastian Bach, of Glenn Gould, and of Adolf Hitler. His rewritings of their work, in which, unlike Wertheimer, he is able both to emulate his models and to preserve his own individuality, have produced one of the most moving as well as the most triumphant Bildungsroman of the modernist period. Thank you.